October 1944. A German sergeant crouches in a flooded trench near the Belgian coast, watching the darkness beyond the Leopold Canal. He hasn't slept in 3 days. The water is knee-deep, and the cold has seeped into his bones. Somewhere out there, beyond the reeds and the fog, they're coming. He's fought the British, he's faced the Americans. But tonight, his unit has been warned about something different. The Canadians are crossing. No one in his company laughs at this news. No one dismisses it. They've heard the stories from soldiers who survived Normandy. They've heard what happened in Italy. The Canadians don't fight like other Allied forces. They attack at night. They use fire, literal fire, to clear positions. And once they take ground, they don't give it back. The sergeant grips his rifle tighter and peers into the blackness. The silence stretches on, broken only by the wind through the dead trees. And then the world ignites. Streams of flame lance across the canal, turning the night orange. The earth shakes with artillery. And through the chaos, through the smoke and the fire, shapes are moving, hundreds of them scrambling up the canal banks with bayonets fixed. In the next 12 hours, half of his regiment will be destroyed. The ones who survive will never forget what it was like to face Canadian infantry. To understand why German soldiers came to fear Canadian forces above almost any other Allied formation, you have to understand where Canada stood in this war and what its soldiers had already proven. Canada was not a superpower. It was a dominion of barely 11 million people, stretched across a vast territory with a small professional army that had been gutted by budget cuts during the Depression. When war broke out in September 1939, the entire Canadian military numbered fewer than 10,000 men. But within 5 years, Canada would field an army of nearly 500,000 soldiers. They would fight in Sicily, in Italy, in Normandy, in the Netherlands. They would storm beaches, clear cities block by block, cross rivers under fire, and endure some of the worst conditions any Allied soldiers faced in Western Europe. And they would earn a reputation that followed them into every engagement. The Germans had already encountered Canadians in the First World War, where the Canadian Corps had become known as shock troops, ferocious, unpredictable, and terrifyingly effective in trench warfare. That reputation had faded somewhat in the interwar years, but it wouldn't take long for German commanders to remember why their predecessors had learned to dread facing Canadian units. What made Canadian infantry different wasn't any single tactic or weapon. It was a combination of factors: aggressive leadership, a willingness to attack at night, exceptional coordination between infantry and artillery, and a refusal to break even when outnumbered or outgunned. By 1944, these qualities would be tested in some of the most brutal fighting of the war. To put faces to this history, we need to follow specific men through specific moments. Private Charlie Martin was 22 years old when his landing craft approached Juno Beach on the morning of June 6, 1944. He was with the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, one of the oldest regiments in the Canadian Army. Charlie had grown up poor during the Depression, working odd jobs before enlisting. He didn't talk much about his reasons for joining. Most men didn't. But like thousands of other young Canadians, he believed in what he was fighting for. Charlie carried a Lee Enfield rifle and 90 rounds of ammunition. He wore a life belt that would do nothing if he went into the water with his heavy pack. In his pocket, he kept a small photograph of his mother, creased from handling. Beside him in the landing craft was Rifleman Doug Hester, just 19, trying not to vomit from the rolling waves. Doug had been a warehouse worker in Toronto before the war. He'd never been overseas, never fired a shot in anger. In approximately 15 minutes, that would change. Sergeant Jack Martin, no relation to Charlie, stood near the bow, watching the coastline grow larger through the spray. Jack had been in the army longer than most. He'd trained hundreds of young soldiers in England, drilling them endlessly on weapons handling and movement under fire. He knew what was waiting on those beaches. He also knew that nothing he'd taught these boys could fully prepare them for it. The preliminary bombardment was supposed to have destroyed the German positions. From the landing craft, the men could hear the thunder of naval guns and see smoke rising from the shore. They allowed themselves a moment of hope. That hope would not survive contact with the beach. The Queen's Own Rifles had been assigned to Nan White sector, directly in front of the town of Bernières-sur-Mer. Their landing craft was supposed to arrive at the same time as specialized tanks that would provide covering fire and clear obstacles. But the rough seas had thrown off the timing. The tanks were late. As the landing craft approached the shore, the men inside could see that something was wrong. The German fortifications weren't destroyed. Machine gun positions, concrete bunkers, mortar emplacements, all of them were intact, barely touched by the bombardment. The Royal Marines lowered the ramps. Doug Hester would later describe what happened. The 3 men in front of him were cut down before they could take a step. He jumped into the water between bursts of fire, landing in the rising blood of his comrades. The cold shocked him. The weight of his equipment dragged him down. Around him, men were screaming, drowning, being torn apart by machine gun fire. He made it to the beach. Somehow he made it to the seawall, but when he looked back, the sand was littered with bodies. The first landing craft to touch down at Nan White lost 10 of its first 11 soldiers, either killed or wounded in the opening seconds. Company B came ashore directly in front of the main German strongpoint, 200 yards east of their intended landing zone. They were caught in a crossfire of mortars and machine guns. Within the first hour, B Company had lost 50% of its men, and yet they didn't stop. Charlie Martin, Doug Hester, Jack Martin, and the survivors who reached the seawall didn't wait for orders. They didn't wait for tank support. They climbed the wall and attacked the German positions with grenades and bayonets. They fought their way through the fortifications, clearing them room by room, position by position. By noon, the Queen's Own Rifles had broken through. What happened at Nan White was replicated across the length of Juno Beach. Canadian units suffered terrible casualties in the initial assault, 340 killed and another 574 wounded before the day was over. The Queen's Own Rifles alone lost 143 men, the highest casualty count of any Canadian regiment on D-Day. But by the end of June 6th, something remarkable had happened. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had advanced farther inland than any other Allied formation, farther than the British at Golden Sword, farther than the Americans at Utah and Omaha. They had pushed nearly 7 miles from the beaches, taking village after village, bypassing resistance that would be mopped up later. British historian John Keegan would later write that the Canadians faced opposition stronger than that at any other beach except Omaha, and still achieved the deepest penetration of the day. The Germans noticed. Within days, reports were circulating through German command about the ferocity of the Canadian assault. The soldiers defending Juno Beach had been from the 716th Infantry Division, a static garrison unit that was not considered elite. But the way they had been overrun, the speed, the aggression, the refusal of Canadian soldiers to take cover or wait for support, made an impression. That impression would only deepen in the months to come. June melted into July, and the fighting in Normandy became a grinding nightmare. The bocage, the hedgerow country of northern France, favoured defenders. Every field was a fortress, every sunken lane was a potential ambush. The Canadians were assigned to push toward Caen, a crucial road junction that had been one of D-Day's primary objectives. It should have fallen within the first week. Instead, it would take more than a month of brutal combat. This was where Canadian units began to encounter German formations of a different caliber. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Youth Division, had been positioned specifically to counterattack the invasion. Its soldiers were young fanatics, many of them teenagers who had been raised on Nazi ideology and trained to fight without mercy. What followed was some of the most vicious combat of the Normandy campaign. Canadian units learned quickly that the 12th SS took few prisoners. In the days following D-Day, more than 150 Canadian soldiers were murdered after surrendering. They were shot in fields, executed in barns, beaten to death in custody. The massacres would later become some of the most documented war crimes committed against Canadian forces. The Canadians responded with fury. Battles like Buren, Orthy, and Carpiquet became legendary within the Canadian Army, not for their strategic significance, but for the savagery of the fighting. Companies that should have been destroyed fought on. Soldiers who should have retreated dug in and held their ground until relieved or killed. At Carpiquet Airfield, Canadian infantry attacked across open ground against fortified hangars and concrete bunkers. The assault took 3 days and cost hundreds of casualties. The Germans were pushed back, retook positions, and were pushed back again. Neither side gave quarter. A German officer captured during the fighting reportedly told his interrogators that he had never encountered troops who attacked with such disregard for their own losses. He had expected the Canadians to break. They hadn't. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the summer of 1944. By the time the Canadians were pulled from the Caen sector in late July, they had suffered nearly 18,000 casualties. Entire companies had been rebuilt multiple times. Replacements who arrived in the morning were sometimes dead by evening. But the Germans had suffered too, and more importantly, they had failed to stop the Canadian advance. The battles around Caen had tied down some of the best German armoured units in Normandy, preventing them from reinforcing the American sector where Operation Cobra was about to blow a hole through German lines. When the breakout came, the Canadians would play a crucial role in closing the trap. The Falaise Pocket, in August 1944, became a killing ground for the German army. Canadian forces attacking from the north helped seal off the escape route for tens of thousands of German soldiers. The carnage was apocalyptic. Burned vehicles, dead horses, corpses stacked in the ditches. Major David Curry of the South Alberta Regiment would earn the Victoria Cross for his actions at Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, where his small force held a crucial crossroads against repeated German breakout attempts. For 36 hours, Curry's men destroyed 7 tanks, 12 armoured vehicles, and 40 other vehicles while capturing nearly 2,000 prisoners. At one point, Curry was personally manning a machine gun while German infantry pressed his position. The Falaise Pocket ended German resistance in Normandy. It also confirmed what German commanders had been warning about since June. Canadian units were not to be underestimated. With France liberated, the war moved north into Belgium and the Netherlands. And here, the Canadians would face their greatest test. The port of Antwerp had been captured by British forces in early September, its dock facilities largely intact. This should have been a logistical triumph. Antwerp was the largest port in northern Europe, capable of supplying the entire Allied advance into Germany. But there was a problem. Antwerp sits at the end of the Scheldt estuary, an 80-kilometre waterway that winds from the North Sea. The Germans still controlled both banks of that estuary. Until they were cleared, not a single supply ship could reach Antwerp. This task fell to the 1st Canadian Army. The Battle of the Scheldt would become the most grueling campaign Canadian forces fought in the entire war. The terrain was a nightmare. Flooded polders, narrow dikes, canals that turned the landscape into a maze of water and mud. Every road was a causeway, exposed on both sides. Every patch of dry ground was fortified. The Germans defending the Scheldt knew exactly how important it was. They had been ordered to hold at all costs. Private William Noel Barclay was 22 years old when his unit, the Royal Montreal Regiment, was ordered to cross the Leopold Canal on the night of October 6, 1944. William had joined the army in 1940 when he was 18. He had spent 4 years training in Canada and England, waiting for the invasion that everyone knew was coming. He had landed in Normandy after D-Day, seen friends wounded and killed, and pushed through France with the rest of the 1st Canadian Army. Now he stood on the south bank of a canal in Belgium, watching specialists prepare weapons that looked like something from a nightmare. The Wasp flamethrowers were mounted on small armored carriers. Their fuel tanks could project a stream of burning liquid more than 100 meters. The plan was simple. The flamethrowers would spray the far bank, setting fire to everything: bunkers, trenches, soldiers. Then the infantry would cross in assault boats and establish a bridgehead. No one had ever tried this on such a scale. At 5:25 in the morning, the darkness exploded into light. The flamethrowers opened up, sending rivers of fire across the water. The men in the assault boats pushed off. William Barclay was in one of the first boats to reach the far shore. What he found there was chaos: burning vegetation, screaming men, German soldiers who had survived the flames now firing from hidden positions. William led his platoon toward their objective. They made it less than 100 meters before German machine guns opened up from multiple directions. William Barclay was killed trying to shield his men from the fire. He was one of 10 soldiers from the Royal Montreal Regiment who died that day at the Leopold Canal. But the bridgehead held. The crossing of the Leopold Canal was only the beginning. What followed was 3 weeks of fighting in conditions that veterans would later describe as worse than anything else they experienced in the war. The Canadians advanced through water that was often waist deep. They dug trenches that filled with mud as fast as they could dig them. They slept in the open during an autumn of constant rain, their weapons corroding, their feet rotting in their boots. The war diary of the Canadian Scottish Regiment captured the misery. Water and soil make mud. Mud sticks to everything. Boots weigh pounds more. Rifles and Brens operate sluggishly. Ammunition becomes wet. Slit trenches allow one to get below ground level, but also contain several inches of thick water. Matches and cigarettes are wet and unusable. And still they attacked. The 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade launched an amphibious assault across the Brachman Inlet, surprising the Germans and establishing a second bridgehead behind the main defensive line. The 7th and 8th Brigades fought their way through the Breskens Pocket, clearing it village by village. The German 64th Infantry Division, a formation built from veterans of the Eastern Front, fought with determination. But they couldn't stop the Canadian advance. By November 2nd, the south bank of the Scheldt had been cleared. The Canadians had taken over 40,000 prisoners and killed or wounded thousands more. Their own casualties exceeded 12,000 men. But the battle wasn't over. On the north bank of the Scheldt, the town of Woensdrecht guarded the approach to the Beveland Peninsula and the island of Walcheren. Take Woensdrecht and the Canadians could cut off the German retreat. Fail, and the battle would drag on. The Black Watch of Canada was ordered to assault German positions near Woensdrecht on October 13, 1944. The men of the Black Watch knew the attack was desperate. The Germans held a raised railway embankment that dominated the surrounding fields. There was no cover, just 1,200 yards of open beet fields between the Canadian lines and the objective. At dawn, Companies B and C advanced across the polders. They were spotted almost immediately. German artillery, mortars and machine guns opened up from multiple positions. The Canadians were caught in the open with nowhere to hide. Some men tried to dig into the soft earth with their bare hands. Others ran forward, hoping to reach the embankment before they were cut down. Neither approach worked. By evening, the Black Watch had lost 145 men, 56 killed, 62 wounded, 27 captured. One company of 90 men was reduced to just 4 soldiers fit for duty. All 4 company commanders were dead. The Canadians called it Black Friday. The disaster at Woensdrecht might have broken another unit. It didn't break the Canadians. 3 days later, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry attacked the same positions at night with every piece of artillery the division could muster. The fighting was ferocious. Hand-to-hand combat raged through the village. But by morning, Woensdrecht was in Canadian hands. The cost was appalling, but the way to Walcheren was open. The final assault on Walcheren Island required everything the Canadians had learned about amphibious warfare. The Royal Air Force bombed the dikes, flooding the lowlands and isolating German defenders on pockets of high ground. Canadian and British commandos landed on the western coast, while the Canadian 2nd Division attacked across a narrow causeway from the east. The causeway assault was one of the most desperate actions of the entire campaign. The Calgary Highlanders advanced along a road barely wide enough for a single vehicle, with water and mud on both sides. German artillery and machine guns covered every meter. Soldiers who fell off the causeway drowned under the weight of their equipment. But they kept going. By November 8th, Walcheren was secured. The Scheldt estuary was open. 3 weeks later, the first Allied supply ships reached Antwerp. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who had initially dismissed the Scheldt campaign as secondary, later admitted he had made a mistake. The campaign had been essential, and the Canadians had won it through sheer determination. The question of why German soldiers feared Canadian infantry has no single answer. It was the accumulation of experiences, Juno Beach, Caen, the Scheldt, that built the reputation. But certain patterns emerge from German accounts. Canadian units attacked at night more frequently than other Allied forces. This wasn't unique to them, but they seemed to embrace night operations with a particular ferocity. German soldiers in the Scheldt described Canadian patrols that appeared out of nowhere, struck hard, and vanished before counterattacks could be organized. Canadian infantry also had a reputation for aggressive pursuit. When German units tried to withdraw, they often found Canadians already flanking them, cutting off retreat routes, forcing them to fight or surrender. The German term for this was Nachdrängen, pressing pursuit, and Canadian units were considered masters of it. There was also the matter of firepower. Canadian infantry worked closely with their artillery, calling in barrages with a precision that other Allied formations sometimes lacked. German defenders learned that any engagement with Canadian forces would quickly bring down accurate shell fire, making fixed positions untenable. And then there was something harder to quantify, a willingness to take casualties without breaking. A German officer captured after the Scheldt campaign told his interrogators that his men had expected Canadian units to withdraw after suffering heavy losses. Instead, the Canadians had continued attacking, throwing in reserves, refusing to give ground even when the tactical situation seemed hopeless. This wasn't bravery in the romantic sense. It was something more like stubbornness, a refusal to accept that a position couldn't be taken or held. The liberation of the Netherlands in the spring of 1945 added a final chapter to the Canadian reputation. As Canadian forces pushed into the Netherlands, they encountered a population that had been starving under German occupation. The Dutch winter of 1944–45, the Hunger winter, had killed more than 20,000 civilians. When Canadian soldiers arrived, they were greeted not as liberators, but as saviors. The gratitude of the Dutch people created bonds that persist to this day. Every year, the Netherlands commemorates Canadian forces with ceremonies and festivals. Tulips planted on Canadian war graves are tended by Dutch schoolchildren who learn the names of soldiers who died before their grandparents were born. For German soldiers who surrendered in the Netherlands, the contrast was stark. They had fought for years to hold territory that hated them. Now they were being marched past crowds that jeered and spat, guarded by soldiers who had earned a reputation for taking no prisoners in the heat of battle, but who now accepted surrenders with professional efficiency. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Canadian forces had captured over 120,000 German prisoners in the final months. They had liberated hundreds of towns and villages. They had paid a price, More than 45,000 Canadian soldiers would be killed in the entire war, with tens of thousands more wounded. In the years after the war, German veterans who wrote memoirs or gave interviews often mentioned Canadian forces. The comments were rarely elaborate, a sentence here, a paragraph there, but they painted a consistent picture. The Canadians fought hard. They didn't give up easily. They were unpredictable in ways that made them dangerous. One German veteran of the Normandy campaign, interviewed decades later, recalled that his unit had learned to recognize Canadian units by their radio traffic. When they heard Canadian voices on the frequency, they knew to expect a night attack. Another veteran, who had served in the Netherlands, remembered that Canadian prisoners were treated with more caution than those from other Allied nations. The guards had heard stories about what happened to Germans who tried to escape from Canadian custody. These memories were not universal. Many German soldiers had no particular view of Canadian forces, having never faced them directly. Others were more impressed by American firepower or Soviet numbers. But among those who had fought the Canadians, at Juno Beach, in the Bocage, at the Scheldt, there was a grudging respect that sometimes bordered on fear. The men who stormed Juno Beach, who fought through the hedgerows, who waded through the flooded polders of the Scheldt, most of them came home. Charlie Martin survived the war. He returned to Canada, married, raised a family, and rarely spoke about what he had seen. When he did speak late in his life, he talked mostly about the men who hadn't made it back. Doug Hester, who had watched his comrades die in the first seconds at Nan-White Beach, lived until 2002. He gave interviews about D-Day, describing the water, the blood, the bodies on the sand. He said he never stopped thinking about the men who fell around him. The Queen's Own Rifles of Canada remains an active regiment today, one of the oldest military units in the country. Their colours carry battle honours from both world wars, names like Ypres and Vimy, Normandy and Caen, Scheldt. The Leopold Canal, where William Barclay died leading his men across the water, is peaceful now. The bunkers are gone, the trees have regrown. There is a small memorial near the crossing point, marking where Canadian soldiers attacked through fire and flood. At Woensdrecht, a memorial honours the men of the Black Watch who fell on Black Friday. Dutch families still tend the site, placing flowers on the anniversary of the battle. A report filed after the war, buried in Canadian military archives, contains an assessment of the Scheldt campaign, written by a captured German staff officer. He described the terrain, the flooding, the misery of fighting in conditions that both sides considered inhuman. He analysed the Canadian tactics, the night attacks, the flamethrowers, the relentless pressure that never allowed his forces to rest or regroup. And then he wrote a single line about the soldiers he had faced. They did not fight like men who expected to survive. They fought like men who had already accepted they would die. He meant it as an observation, not a compliment. But perhaps it explains something about why German soldiers learned to fear Canadian infantry during the Second World War. The Canadians weren't fighting for glory or conquest. They were fighting to end something terrible, and they were willing to pay whatever price that took. In the end, they paid it. And the Germans remembered. The Adegem Canadian War Cemetery in Belgium holds the remains of 848 Canadian soldiers, most of whom fell during the Battle of the Scheldt. The grass is always trimmed, the stones are always clean, and every year on the anniversary of the Leopold Canal crossing, local school children walk among the graves, reading the names aloud. **. Private William Noel Barclay is buried there. He was 22 years old.